All right, welcome to our second segment on body composition and how it relates to your personal health. You should have already watched the first part of this series, which is body composition part one, in which we covered a lot of things about so you understand what we're talking about when we talk about body composition, as well as why we're talking about it. In this discussion today, we're going to be not starting there. Let's skip down a little bit farther here. I hit the wrong one. There we go. So in this segment, we're going to move on with this discussion. So the question is, we've kind of established why it's important to understand, why excessive body fat, what it can kind of lead to as far as some of the health concerns with it. We've also established that there's different body types and things like that, but we're going to talk a little bit more about how to understand what your body fat percentage is, how to measure it. So there's several methods you can use to determine what your body fat percentage is. The first couple are basically involving a certain type of weighing where you're using water of some sort. So we call it hydrostatic weighing. Basically what you do is there's a special scale set up in water, and then when you go weigh on that scale in water obviously adds a certain amount of buoyancy to weighing, and based on the amount of body fat that a person has, that you can kind of calculate based on what their weight is outside of water versus their weight in water. There's an equation to figure out what their body fat percentage would be based on that. Body fat is a little bit more buoyant than dense body mass. So that would be kind of the logic behind how that works. There's another system called a bod pod, which a lot of universities have. Typically, to do something like a hydrostatic weighing test or a bod pod, you'd probably have to go to like a university's exercise physiology lab to go into and use some of their specialized equipment that they have there. These aren't typically easily found, but they do exist, and sometimes they charge a fee. Sometimes you have to have some kind of special appointment to go do it. But that's kind of one of the things that makes it a little bit tougher to get to like a hydrostatic weighing test or to a bod pod test. One of the things you're seeing a lot more now is what's called electrical impedance. Electrical impedance is basically a certain type of scale, a specialized scale that can shoot a very low electrical current through your body, and based on the impedance that those electrical signals run into, they can calculate the amount of body fat a person has in their body. The next type of test is what's called skin calipers. These are basically just a manual pinching device that have a little measurement tool on it as well, a little gauge or a little dial that shows what the measurement is of the fold of skin or the fold of body tissue that is measured between these calipers. And when you use calipers, there's specific places that on your body where you're supposed to actually assess the thickness of the tissue. So it might be like a part of your leg, it might be a part of your waist, part of your arm, and things like that. And so there's a couple different tests a couple different methods used for the skin caliper test, but that's something that's been done in the past. Sometimes in like physical education classes in the past, they've been able to do those skin caliper tests in those classes. Just because electrical impedance is so much quicker, a lot of times a lot of schools are using more of that method. A lot of fitness centers and even personal trainers will typically use more of an electrical impedance instead of the skin calipers, just because like I said, it is a lot quicker and a little simpler. Some other ways you can measure girth measure, a body circumference. There's different measurements you can take. There's a waist to hip ratio method that you can take. There's a body fat scale, and then there's also the BMI, the body mass index, which we talked about in part one. All of these methods have kind of, pros and cons about them. The most accurate ones up there are going to be your hydrostatic weighing or your bod pod. The challenge with those is they're difficult to have access to because there's just not a lot of them. You'd have to typically go, like I said, to a university. Electrical impedance is a really great way to go, but it does not have it doesn't have quite the reliability that the pod or the hydrostatic scale are going to have, but it's a lot easier to come by, right? The challenge with electrical impedance as well is there's a lot of devices that represent themselves as accurate electrical impedance devices, but there can be a high degree of accuracy. And so even the most accurate electrical impedance scales, they typically cost a lot more money. But even with that, there's still, a degree of variability on its accuracy. And so there's typically, a little bit of give or take on what that measurement ends up being. Skin calipers, obviously, as well, also have room for error, both user error plus depending on the person's body type, the sites that are kind of the standard place to measure may not be the most accurate way to measure that. And so there's a little bit of margin of error in that test as well. And then, your waist to hip ratios and things like that are kind of, they're helpful. They're kind of like as accurate maybe as like your body mass index. And again, the body mass index is a good method. A lot of doctors' offices use body mass index to kind of indicate if a person needs to maybe think about losing a little bit of weight, to try to get to a more ideal body weight for them. But it's not perfect. Again, if a person has, weighs a little bit more, but has a higher bone density or has higher muscle density because they're just more fit and they actually maybe naturally carry less body fat, that body mass index may not be the most accurate way to assess their body fat. So hydrostatic weighing, we've kind of talked about some of the advantages and disadvantages. This is kind of what this looks like. It's an underwater test, and it measures body fat based on what the person weighs in the water. And it's just kind of difficult to have access to those. Bod pod is another method that, again, is difficult to have access to. Electrical impedance looks like this is one that's handheld. There's others that are scales that you actually stand on, but this is kind of what it looks like to do an electrical impedance scale or an electrical impedance test. Skin calipers, this is kind of what that looks like. For men, they do the chest, the abdomen, the thigh. Women, they'll do the triceps, waist, and thigh, and measure those sites. And based on what those measurements are, I think you have a decent calculation for what that person's body fat percentage probably is. Girth measurement, again, we kind of talked about already. That's just measuring different areas of the body. Your waist to hip measurements is another one. That's where you're going to measure your waist as well as your hips. Body fat scales, again, they typically use kind of an electrical impedance method. Some are more accurate than others. Then your body mass index this is the equation that you can use to calculate what a person's body mass index would be. A simple way to do that is to use that chart that I showed you in part 1, which I've also included in part 2 right here. Anything over 30, body mass index of 30 is considered obese, and you can calculate what your body mass index is based on what your height is in inches and what you weigh. So if you are 70 inches tall and let's say you weigh 167 pounds, you would have a body mass index of 24. So your body mass index kind of underweight, if you're in a body mass index of 17, kind of that less than 20 range, you're going to be considered underweight. Normal weight is typically that 22 to 24 range. Slightly overweight is kind of 26 to 29 in general, and then overweight would be over 30, and then extremely overweight would be 40 or above. So we've talked a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of various body fat tests. So this is something that you can think about. If you wanted to have your body fat measured, what would be the easiest way and simple way for you to be able to measure your body fat? Obviously, you could do your BMI index by just doing this lesson and going back to that chart. But you probably know of a place where you can go do an electrical impedance test fairly easily if you wanted to get really really technical, you could go to a facility that has a bod pod or a hydrostatic scale. So those are the ways that you find out what your body fat percentage is. In the first lecture, you learned kind of the important terms of involved with body composition, as well as why it's important, why it matters to pay attention to the percentage of body fat a person has in terms of life expectancy, as well as other risks other health risks that can be a part of that. And then in the second lesson, we've learned about how to actually assess body fat percentage. So that concludes our second part of this series. Come back for our third part, and we'll get into the next segment there. After you've finished this second part, make sure you've completed your study guide or any other assignments or notes you're assigned to do or quizzes before moving on. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you at the next one.